Hello and thank you for downloading. My name's Steve Johnson, and this is the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Welcome to episode 4, which is an accompanying episode to the Inquest and Inquiries site on the Mid-Staffordshire Inquiry and Berwick report. In order to properly introduce this, again, a section where artificial intelligence is going to discuss the reports and documentation associated with Berwick and also with the Francis report, which was the public inquiry into Mid-Staffordshire, I feel the actual letter written by the chairman of the inquiry to the Secretary of State at the time is probably a really good way to introduce this. I'll read it verbatim. As you know, I was appointed by your predecessor to chair a public inquiry under the Inquiries Act 2005 into the serious failings at the Mid-Staffordshire NHS Foundation Trust. Under the terms of reference of the inquiry, I now submit you the final report. Building on the report of the first inquiry, the story it tells is first and foremost of appalling suffering of many patients. This was primarily caused by a serious failure on the part of a provider trust board. It did not listen sufficiently to its patients and staff or ensure the correction of deficiencies brought to the trust's attention. Above all, it failed to tackle an insidious negative culture involving a tolerance of poor standards and a disengagement from managerial and leadership responsibilities. This failure was in part the consequence of allowing a focus on reaching national access targets, achieving financial balance, and seeking foundation trust status to be at the cost of delivering acceptable standards of care. I won't go on for the rest of the letter. Safe to say that it actually says that the scandal is even worse because there were checks and balances that should have addressed this. Only to say that actually my interpretation of how bad this scandal was is magnified by knowing of the number of inquiries and scandals and situations where exactly the same things happened previously. And going all the way back into history, one of the earliest examples is the Normanton Hospital scandal, where again there was a complete failure of standards, and not only a failure of standards, but a failure of the system and governance measures in place to actually take action. I hope you find it interesting to hear the artificial intelligence discussing the work. It is worth stressing, as I do, once again, that people died and were seriously injured or harmed physically or mentally as a result of the scandals that refined the lessons found in this inquiry. Equally, it's important I stress to you that the voices you'll hear now will actually be computers and not real people, and their analysis is based on a computational analysis of the documentation. I hope you find it interesting. Do please comment about this or get in contact if there's something you'd like to see analysed further.
Hey there, ready to take a trip back in time with me? We're diving into the aftermath of the Francis report, a real watershed moment for the NHS. You've sent over a whole stack of articles, research, even some personal notes. Looks like you're really trying to get a handle on how this report shook things up.
It certainly did send shockwaves through the system.
Yeah.
What's fascinating is that the report didn't just sit on a shelf gathering dust. It sparked a frenzy of activity across NHS acute trusts.
I bet. From what I've skimmed so far, we're talking a total overhaul. New policies, frameworks, even a restructuring of how these trusts were governed. But amidst all that change, I'm sensing a real tension. The desire for top-notch patient care crashing headfirst into the reality of limited budgets and a regulatory maze.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's precisely what makes this deep dive so compelling. We're going to trace how trusts grappled with turning the report's recommendations into reality, the hurdles they faced, and ultimately what proved successful and what fell short.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our sources seem pretty unanimous on one thing. The Francis report wasn't just another bureaucratic exercise. It was a wake-up call that reverberated across the NHS, particularly within acute trusts.
The report zeroed in on 5 key areas demanding immediate action. Fundamental standards of care, a radical shift towards openness and transparency, bolstering nursing standards, fostering patient-centered leadership, and a smarter use of information.
And from what I'm seeing, trusts took those directives seriously. They didn't just pay lip service. There's a lot here about increased staff training, particularly around owning up to mistakes, which is huge, Not exactly the NHS culture I'm used to. Plus a flurry of new governance structures to keep a tighter rein on things. And a big push to actually listen to what patients were saying about their experiences.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this as we go. Even with the best intentions, translating those recommendations into actual practice was anything but smooth sailing.
Oh yeah, the sources don't sugarcoat that. It's like every trust was battling the same old budgetary demons. Imagine trying to revolutionize patient care while also juggling shrinking funds. Talk about a migraine waiting to happen.
And the financial strain was just one piece of the puzzle. They were also grappling with the demands of multiple regulators, Think Monitor, CQC, each with their own pet projects and priorities. Plus, trying to forge effective relationships within local health economies proved tricky, with different stakeholders often pulling in opposite directions.
It sounds like a recipe for chaos. Too many cooks in the kitchen, each with a different recipe.
That's a great way to put it. And then there's the whole issue of diluted messages. Imagine a game of telephone where the board's commitment to change gets garbled as it travels down through middle management. Even if those at the top were gung-ho, it didn't always translate to what was happening on the wards.
So you've got these big systemic pressures squeezing the trusts, but what about the boards themselves? What role did they play in all of this? Were they just helpless bystanders, or did they have some agency to steer the ship?
Well, the sources offer a pretty compelling framework for understanding the board's role in the wake of Francis. They propose 5 key functions: conscience, censor, diplomat, coach, and shock absorber.
Okay, those are some interesting labels. I'm picturing a board meeting that's part therapy session, part spy thriller, part... I'm not sure what a shock absorber would look like in a boardroom. Break it down for me. What does it actually mean for a board to embody these roles?
Think of the conscience as the ethical compass guiding the board's decisions. It's about holding themselves accountable for the quality of care, even when it means making tough choices. The censor role is about actively seeking out information, not just waiting for it to land on their desks. They have to be tuned into the pulse of the wards, understanding what patients are experiencing, where the risks lie.
So they're like the eyes and ears of the organization, but not just passively observing, actively seeking out the truth, even the unpleasant bits.
Exactly. Now, the diplomat role is all about navigating that complex web of relationships we talked about earlier. They're the negotiators, balancing internal pressures with external demands, trying to find common ground between competing agendas.
Sounds like a tightrope walk. Okay, what about coach and shock absorber? Those still have me stumped.
As a coach, the board needs to empower and support staff, equipping them to deliver the best possible care. It's about fostering a culture of learning and improvement, not just pointing fingers when things go wrong. And finally, the shock absorber role is about shielding the organization from external turbulence, whether it's political pressure, media scrutiny, or funding cuts.
So the board as a buffer zone, protecting the organization from the storms raging outside, that's a lot of responsibility resting on their shoulders. But are these roles just theoretical ideals, or did the sources provide concrete examples of boards actually living up to these expectations?
That's a great question, and one that I'm eager to dig into with you next. What's fascinating is that the sources aren't just spouting theory. They actually offer some compelling real-world examples of boards putting these roles into action, facing down challenges, and sometimes even exceeding expectations. But before we get to those, I'm curious, what stood out to you so far? What's piqued your interest as we've been talking?
Well, what strikes me is that even with all these frameworks and roles, there's this underlying sense that true change requires more than just structural tweaks. It's like everyone's dancing around this big elephant in the room. The need for a fundamental shift in culture.
You're absolutely right. That's precisely where we're headed next. And believe me, the sources have a lot to say about the challenges and triumphs of cultivating a new culture within the NHS. Let's dive in and see what they uncovered, shall we? You know, when we talk about culture change, it's easy to get swept up in the big ideas. But the sources remind us that these transformations play out in messy, human ways. They highlight the very real struggles trusts faced, especially when it came to money.
Yeah, that financial pressure keeps popping up. It's like this background hum that never quite goes away. I'm curious, do the sources get into specifics about the kinds of financial binds these trusts were in?
They do, and it's eye-opening. One report paints a stark picture of the NHS in the mid-2000s, describing a system-wide scramble to balance the books. Healthcare costs had ballooned, and there was this intense pressure to rein things in.
So it wasn't just a few isolated trusts struggling, it was a systemic issue.
Precisely. And it led to some tough choices. One chief executive's testimony really stuck with me. He described how his primary care trust was essentially forced to prioritize financial stability over quality of care. They were so fixated on hitting those budget targets that monitoring the actual quality of services took a backseat.
Wow, that's a heartbreaking dilemma. It's like they were being asked to choose between keeping the lights on and actually fulfilling their mission.
And the pressure didn't stop there. Individual trusts were under constant scrutiny from strategic health authorities. These higher-level bodies tasked with overseeing their performance. Imagine having to submit these detailed monthly reports, knowing that if your numbers were off, the SHA would come knocking, demanding a microscopic examination of every penny spent.
So not only were they grappling with these tight budgets, but they also had this constant fear of Big Brother looking over their shoulder. Did any of the sources mention how trusts coped with this financial strain? Did they find creative solutions, or was it just a matter of cutting corners?
Well, some trusts resorted to desperate measures just to stay afloat. One example that stands out is this thing called brokerage, essentially an interest-free loan that trusts could take out to cover their debts. They were expected to repay it within 3 years. But it just goes to show how precarious their financial situation was.
It makes you wonder how they were supposed to implement all these ambitious reforms from the Francis Report when they were barely keeping their heads above water financially.
It's a valid question, and one that the sources grapple with. It's clear that those financial constraints created a real tension, a constant undercurrent of anxiety that made it incredibly difficult to prioritize quality improvement.
And let's not forget those multiple regulators we talked about earlier. It's one thing to manage a tight budget, but quite another to do so while juggling conflicting demands from different oversight bodies.
You're absolutely right. Those competing priorities added another layer of complexity. Several board members were accounted feeling trapped between a rock and a hard place, trying to appease regulators who weren't always on the same page.
I can imagine the frustration. It's like trying to please multiple bosses, each with a different idea of what success looks like.
Precisely. And as if that wasn't enough, the NHS landscape itself was in constant flux. Reorganizations were frequent, and the sources suggest that this instability actually hindered progress. It's like trying to build a house on shifting sands.
You're giving me a headache just thinking about it. What kind of reorganizations are we talking about? Was it just shuffling departments around? Or were there more fundamental changes to the system?
This was a period of major upheaval for the NHS. One significant shift was the push towards patient choice and competition. Trusts were suddenly thrust into this market-like environment, vying for patients and the funding that came with them.
So on top of everything else, they had to worry about marketing and attracting patients?
Exactly. It was a whole new way of thinking for many trusts, and it added to the pressure they were already facing. And then there was this ongoing process of converting trusts into foundation trusts, which came with its own set of challenges and expectations.
It sounds like the rules of the game were constantly changing, making it almost impossible to keep up, let alone excel.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And speaking of those conflicting demands from regulators, there's a particularly illuminating example that comes to mind. Remember, monitor the regulator responsible for foundation trusts.
Yeah, they were one of the big players we talked about earlier.
Well, the source material highlights a specific instance of tension between Monitor and the Healthcare Commission, the predecessor to the CQC. The HCC was investigating a trust for some serious patient safety concerns, but hadn't yet made formal recommendations to Monitor about what action to take.
That seems strange. Why wouldn't they share their concerns with Monitor right away?
It appears the HCC was still gathering evidence, wanting a more complete picture before making any pronouncements. But in the meantime, Monitor felt they couldn't intervene without a formal assessment from the HCC.
So they were essentially stuck in this bureaucratic limbo, each waiting for the other to make the first move.
Precisely. And this bureaucratic bottleneck highlights a potential flaw in the system. One of the sources calls it the gap between evidence and information, arguing that this delay may have prevented timely action to protect patients.
It's like they were so focused on following the rules that they lost sight of the real people at stake.
That's a powerful observation. And sadly, the sources suggest that this wasn't an isolated incident. We see other instances where regulators and oversight bodies might have missed opportunities to intervene earlier or take more decisive action.
Are there any specific examples that stand out?
Well, there's a particularly troubling case involving a patient who suffered a serious adverse event. The National Patient Safety Agency flagged this case and requested details of the trust's investigation. But it turned out there hadn't been an investigation at all.
Hold on, they didn't even bother to investigate a serious patient safety incident.
That's right. The system at the time relied on the line manager to decide whether an incident warranted further investigation. But in this case, it appears that step was simply skipped. It was only after the NPSA got involved that an investigation finally took place.
So there was a real risk of things slipping through the cracks, especially if those responsible for reporting were also potentially implicated in what went wrong.
Exactly. And this lack of accountability emerges as a recurring theme in the sources. We see instances of trusts failing to follow up on serious concerns, conducting superficial investigations, and even providing misleading information to regulators and commissioners.
Yeah, it paints a rather bleak picture. It's like there was this culture of complacency, a sense that things weren't perfect, but a reluctance to truly confront the magnitude of the problem.
You've hit on a crucial point, and it brings us full circle to that urgent need for cultural transformation.
Because even the most meticulously crafted policies and regulations are meaningless without a genuine commitment to transparency, accountability, and putting patients at the heart of everything.
Absolutely. And when it comes to transparency, the sources offer some concrete examples of what that looks like in practice. One report advocates for a radical shift in how information is shared with patients and visitors. They suggest providing a wealth of information about the ward, their care, and how to raise concerns.
So empowering patients with knowledge, not just treating them as passive recipients of care.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond just handing out leaflets. The report proposes that patients receive an oral induction from a senior nurse upon arrival, allowing for personalized information and an opportunity to ask questions.
That's a great idea. It humanizes the experience and creates a sense of partnership.
Exactly. And another key aspect of transparency they highlight is staff identity.
You mean making sure everyone is clearly identifiable so patients know who they're dealing with?
Precisely. They emphasize the importance of legible and visible name badges, especially for doctors who might not always wear them in a way that's easily seen. And they suggest that staff consistently introduce themselves to patients, reinforcing that sense of recognition and personal connection.
Simple but effective. It's all about fostering trust and building relationships.
Absolutely. And of course, transparency also extends to things like cleanliness and hygiene. The sources stress that a visibly clean and well-maintained environment is crucial. And it's not just the responsibility of cleaning staff. Everyone should be vigilant about keeping things tidy and addressing any issues.
So it's about creating a culture of shared responsibility.
Yeah.
Where everyone feels ownership over the environment.
You got it. And all of these elements, information sharing, staff identification, visible cleanliness, they all point towards a deeper cultural shift. The sources argue that the NHS needs a culture that prizes openness, honesty, and a willingness to learn from mistakes.
Because without that foundation, all the other changes, the structural tweaks, the new policies, they won't have the intended impact.
Exactly. And to achieve this cultural metamorphosis, the sources highlight a few key ingredients: strong leadership that embodies these values, a system that rewards and encourages transparency, accessible and reliable information, and tools to actually measure the cultural health of the organization.
So it's a multifaceted approach, a symphony of interconnected elements working in harmony. But I'm curious, do the sources get into specifics about what strong leadership looks like? How do you cultivate those values in a system as vast and complex as the NHS?
They certainly do. One report lays out a whole set of values and behaviors for NHS leaders, emphasizing qualities like integrity, compassion, and a commitment to continuous improvement. They go beyond just listing traits, though. They stress the importance of leaders walking the walk, not just talking the talk, truly embodying these values in their actions.
It's about leading by example, right? Showing, not just telling what good leadership looks like.
Exactly. And they highlight the importance of clear communication. Leaders need to be able to articulate their vision, inspire others to get on board, and create a shared sense of purpose.
It's like being the conductor of an orchestra, bringing all the different instruments together to create something harmonious.
I love that analogy. And it ties back to those 5 board rules we discussed earlier. The sources suggest that effective leadership requires a blend of all those qualities: the ethical compass, the vigilance, the diplomacy, the supportive coaching, even the ability to absorb shocks and protect the organization.
That's a tall order. It makes you wonder if anyone can truly live up to those expectations.
While the sources don't shy away from the challenges of leadership, one report acknowledges that many leaders felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of external demands. They were bombarded with requests from regulators, commissioners, the media. It was like a constant barrage. They felt like they were always putting out fires, leaving little time for strategic thinking or planning for the future.
So they were drowning in the day-to-day, with no space to come up for air and see the bigger picture. Did the sources offer any solutions to this problem? Or were they just documenting the struggle?
They do offer some insights. One key takeaway is the need to provide leaders with more support and resources. They were often thrown into these demanding roles without adequate training or guidance, and they lacked the infrastructure to effectively manage the onslaught of demands.
It's like sending someone into battle without proper armor or weaponry.
Exactly. And this points to a broader systemic issue: the need to create an environment where leadership is nurtured and supported, not set up for failure.
Because if those at the helm are struggling, the whole ship is going to be tossed about.
Precisely. And, the sources remind us that leadership isn't just about those at the very top. It's a quality that needs to be cultivated at all levels of the organization. They advocate for a model of distributed leadership, where everyone feels empowered to take initiative, make decisions, and contribute to the overall mission.
So it's not just about having a few heroic figures at the top, but about fostering a culture where everyone feels like a leader in their own right. Did the sources provide any examples of this distributed leadership in action?
They did. One account that really resonated with me was from a medical director who described her experience of feeling isolated and unsupported in her role. She found that because there was no medical director at the primary care trust level, she didn't have the same access to the Strategic Health Authority or the PCT as other executives.
So she was kind of left out in the cold, excluded from those crucial decision-making circles.
Exactly. And that lack of connection made it much harder for her to advocate for change and ensure that the medical perspective was properly represented. It highlights how important it is to create pathways for leadership at all levels and to ensure that everyone feels connected and supported.
It's like a reminder that communication and collaboration are essential, not just between different organizations, but within organizations as well.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us back to the core message of the Francis Report: the need for systemic change. It's not enough to focus on individual leaders or isolated incidents. We need to address the underlying structures and processes that create these challenges in the first place.
It's about shifting the whole ecosystem, not just rearranging the furniture.
Exactly. And speaking of shifting the ecosystem, our sources delve into another crucial aspect of the post-Francis landscape: the evolving role of regulators.
The Francis Report definitely shook things up in that department. It wasn't just about individual trusts changing their practices. It was about rethinking how the whole system was overseen and regulated.
Absolutely. The sources point to several significant changes that occurred in the years following the report. For example, the Healthcare Commission, which was the main regulatory body at the time, was eventually merged with other organizations to form the Care Quality Commission, or CQC, which we know is still the primary healthcare regulator in England today.
But it wasn't just a name change, right? The CQC's approach to regulation was heavily influenced by the lessons learned from mid-staffs, which of course was the focus of the Francis Report.
Exactly. The CQC adopted a much more proactive and patient-centered approach to regulation. Instead of simply checking whether organizations were meeting standards on paper, they started focusing more on direct observation of care, interviews with patients and staff, and a deeper analysis of clinical outcomes.
So they were getting their hands dirty, actually going into hospitals and observing what was happening, rather than just relying on reports and paperwork.
Exactly. They were getting a first-hand look at the reality of care, not just the sanitized version presented in official documents. And they placed a much greater emphasis on transparency and accountability, making sure that information about the quality of care was readily available to the public.
So empowering patients and families with knowledge, giving them the tools to make informed decisions about their care.
Precisely. And speaking of this more proactive approach, there's a specific example from the sources that illustrates it perfectly. During a CQC inspection, they uncovered some serious concerns about hygiene practices at a trust. But instead of just accepting the trust's assurances that they were addressing the issue, the inspectors dug deeper. They actually observed practices, interviewed staff, and reviewed records to make sure that real change was happening.
No more taking things at face value. They were holding organizations accountable, making sure that words were translated into action.
Exactly. And this more rigorous approach to regulation was a direct response to the failures exposed at mid-staffs. It highlights the crucial role that regulators play in protecting patients and ensuring high standards of care.
It's a reminder that sometimes you need an external force, a watchdog, to push for change and keep everyone honest.
Absolutely. And the sources point to another crucial aspect of effective regulation: information sharing. They stress the need for seamless communication between regulators, commissioners, providers, and other key stakeholders. Everyone involved needs access to the same information so they can identify potential problems early on and take coordinated action.
It makes sense. If everyone's working from a different set of data, it's going to be impossible to get everyone on the same page.
Exactly. And there's a rather striking example from the sources that highlights the dangers of information silos. Remember the HPA, the Health Protection Agency?
Yeah, they're responsible for things like infection control and public health.
Well, it turns out that they had information about potential problems at Mid-Staffs, but they didn't share it with Monitor, which, as we discussed, was the regulator for foundation trusts.
Wait, seriously, why on earth wouldn't they share that information?
It seems there was a misunderstanding about Monitor's role. The HPA assumed that Monitor was primarily focused on financial matters, and that the quality of care was still the responsibility of commissioners and performance managers.
So a simple communication breakdown, a failure to connect the dots, had potentially disastrous consequences.
Unfortunately, yes. It's a stark reminder of how crucial it is to have clear channels of communication and a shared understanding of everyone's roles and responsibilities. Information is only powerful if it's shared and acted upon.
It's like that old game of telephone where the message gets distorted as it's passed along, except in this case, the stakes were incredibly high.
Exactly. And this whole discussion about information sharing leads us to a broader point, the power of information itself. The sources emphasize the need for robust systems to collect, analyze, and share data about the quality of care. They talk about using data to identify trends, track progress, and hold organizations accountable.
What gets measured gets managed right. You can't improve what you don't understand.
Precisely. And they highlight the potential for data transparency to empower patients and families, giving them the information they need to make informed choices about their care.
So data as a tool for patient empowerment, not just a way to monitor and control.
Exactly. But they also caution against the potential pitfalls of data. Data can be misinterpreted or misused, and they emphasize the importance of protecting patient privacy.
It's a powerful tool that needs to be wielded responsibly.
Absolutely. And speaking of powerful tools, we can't overlook the importance of patient feedback. Patients and families are on the front lines of care. They see things that others might miss, and their experiences are invaluable for driving improvement.
They're the ultimate experts on what it's like to receive care. Their voices need to be heard, not just as anecdotes, but as valuable data points.
Exactly. And the Francis Report actually spurred several changes designed to amplify the voice of patients and families. One notable example is the creation of Health Watch England, an independent organization that acts as a champion for health and social care consumers.
I've heard of Health Watch. They gather patient feedback, raise concerns with providers and commissioners, and help people navigate the healthcare system.
Exactly. They act as a bridge between patients and the system, empowering patients to share their experiences and advocate for better care. And beyond just collecting feedback, the sources highlight the importance of involving patients and families in the design and delivery of services.
Because they're the ones who ultimately know what works and what doesn't. They're the ones living with the consequences of the system's successes and failures.
Precisely. And speaking of patient voices, there's one powerful example from the sources that really embodies this idea of patients as agents of change. Remember Julie Bailey?
Yes. She was one of the key figures in exposing the horrific care at Mid-Staffs.
Exactly. After her mother died at the hospital, Julie Bailey formed a campaign group called Cure the NHS, determined to fight for better care. She and other families affected by the scandal bravely shared their stories, challenged the authorities, and played a crucial role in bringing about change.
It's a reminder that even in the face of immense power, individual voices can make a difference, especially when they join together and demand to be heard.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to a fundamental principle that echoes throughout all our sources, the need for a truly patient-centered healthcare system.
A system where patients are seen as partners, not just passive recipients of care. A system that prioritizes their needs, values their experiences, and empowers them to make informed choices.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that the Francis Report had a profound and lasting impact on the NHS. It exposed deep-seated flaws, triggered a wave of reforms, and ultimately led to a number of significant improvements. But as the sources make clear, change is an ongoing process, a journey, not a destination.
It requires sustained effort, vigilance, a willingness to learn from the past, and a constant focus on what truly matters, providing safe, compassionate, and patient-centered care.
And that brings us to a crucial question for you, the listener. If the Francis Report was about creating a more patient-centered healthcare system, how can you use what you've learned to advocate for better care, not just in the UK, but within your own healthcare experiences? How can you be a voice for change, a champion for quality and compassion?
That's a powerful question to consider. By understanding the complexities, the challenges, the triumphs, and the failures, you're now equipped to engage in meaningful conversations about healthcare, to ask the right questions, to demand better, and to be a force for positive change.
Remember, every voice matters. Every story has the power to inspire action. By sharing your experiences, by speaking up, by demanding better, we can collectively create a healthcare system that truly puts patients first.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the aftermath of the Francis Report. We hope you found it informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep advocating for a better, healthier world.
Thank you for listening to the Inquests and Inquiries podcast. Remember, you can find more information on the website, inquestsandinquiries.com, or on the YouTube channel as well. Link in the notes.